Claire always carried the address book with her. Nobody in the family knew why. It was a small black book with cracked corners and yellowed pages that felt as though they might tear if you turned them too quickly. When she died at 93, it ended up in a box of things nobody wanted. I brought it home because throwing it away felt worse than keeping it. Most of the pages were filled with names, addresses, birthdays, and little notes squeezed into the margins. Some names had been crossed out, others covered half a page. One name appeared more than any other: Margaret Voss. My grandmother had copied different addresses beside it over the years. There were reminders about birthdays, notes about presents, even a list of foods she liked. I asked my mother whether she'd ever heard of Margaret Voss. She hadn't. My aunt hadn't either. Neither had any of the older relatives I called over the next few days. A week later, I opened the address book again. The addresses were still there. The reminders were still there. Margaret Voss wasn't. I thought I'd remembered it wrong until I found a photograph I'd taken of the page the night before. Her name was sitting exactly where I remembered it. I looked back at the book on my table. The space was empty. After that, I started photographing every page before I put the book away. It didn't stop with Margaret. A few weeks later, another name disappeared. Then another. The photographs never changed. The book always did. Nobody I asked remembered those people anymore. I started looking for them anywhere I thought a name might survive. School yearbooks, property records, old newspapers on microfilm, church bulletins that smelled like dust every time I opened them. Most evenings ended the same way, with me driving home, carrying nothing except another dead end. The few things I did find never seemed to stay useful for long. Writing faded from the backs of photographs. Articles I knew I'd bookmarked were gone when I came back for them. Before long, I had a habit I never mentioned to anyone. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, walk into the spare room, and check that the address book was still sitting on the shelf. It wasn't theft I worried about. I kept expecting to open it one morning and find there had never been anything written inside at all. By then, I was back at my grandmother's house almost every weekend. I'd gone through the obvious places more than once: filing cabinets, kitchen drawers, the desk beside her bed. Every time I found another missing name, I'd think of somewhere else she might have hidden an explanation. The attic was the only part of the house I still hadn't searched properly. I wasn't looking for a notebook. I was trying to find the box of Christmas decorations when I noticed a stack of old account books tied together with string. One of them wasn't an account book at all. The first few pages were ordinary enough: shopping lists, doctor appointments, utility bills copied down for no reason I could work out. Then the names started appearing. Every page was about somebody from the address book. My grandmother wasn't writing down biographies. She was trying to hold on to the little things that disappear first. One person hated mushrooms. Another always arrived early to family dinners. Someone else laughed so hard they snorted whenever they couldn't catch their breath. Every few pages, she wrote the same 2 words: still holding. I didn't understand them until I reached the first name she'd crossed out in the address book. Beside it, she had written, "Couldn't hold anymore." I turned back through the notebook after that and realized she wasn't keeping a journal. She was leaving herself reminders of people she was afraid the world might forget. For almost a week, the notebook stayed exactly as I'd left it. I stopped expecting the next page to explain everything. The address book sat on the shelf in the spare bedroom, and some days I managed not to look at it until I was getting ready for bed. Then, one Sunday afternoon, I opened it again and found a name that hadn't been there before. It belonged to a coworker I'd had lunch with the day before. A few days later, my cousin Rachel appeared on another page. That Sunday, my uncle asked whether Rachel would be bringing dessert for dinner, then stopped because he couldn't remember her husband's name. My aunt looked at him, ready to answer, but nothing came out. After a long silence, she laughed and blamed it on getting older. Nobody else laughed before dinner was over. They were arguing about whether Rachel had even been at Christmas the year before. I drove home without finishing my meal because I couldn't stop thinking about the address book. That night, I noticed a section of pages near the front cover had been glued together so carefully I almost missed them. There was one photograph underneath. Beside it lay a folded birth certificate. Neither belonged to me. The girl in the photograph looked familiar in the way strangers sometimes do, as though I'd known her once and forgotten where. The birth certificate carried a different name, different parents, and the same birthday as mine. Folded behind it was a note in my grandmother's handwriting. I couldn't keep her. I tried for years. When she started fading, I made another place for her to go. I checked the compartment again because I couldn't believe she'd hidden only a single note. There wasn't another page tucked behind it. There wasn't a diary explaining what she'd meant or who the girl was supposed to be. I spent the rest of the night at my kitchen table with tax returns, school records, and medical forms spread out around me, lining up dates against a birth certificate that shouldn't have existed. Somewhere before sunrise, I stopped trying to prove the note wrong. I was looking for one piece of paper that showed I'd been here before my grandmother decided somebody else needed my place. I called my mother that afternoon. I never mentioned the address book or the photograph. I asked about a holiday we'd taken when I was 7. She used to tell that story every Christmas, and I could still remember the way she always began it. The line went quiet, except for a faint clicking sound somewhere in the background. Then she asked what trip I meant. I started filling in the details. Halfway through, she stopped me and asked who I was. She sounded exactly the way people do when they've answered a call from a number they don't recognize and are trying not to be rude. I ended the call before she spoke again. When I came back into the room, the address book was still lying where I'd left it. Every page was blank. The names were gone. The notes were gone. Even the pages that had once been covered with crossed-out entries looked untouched. I reached for the birth certificate, but it had disappeared too. The photograph was still there. The bench wasn't empty anymore because someone had been removed from it. 3 days have passed since then. Some records still exist, others don't. Yesterday, I found my high school yearbook. The space where my senior photograph should have been was empty. The address book is beside me while I write this. I still open it a few times every day, even though nothing has changed. This morning, I had to look up my mother's phone number because I couldn't remember it. I've known that number for 20 years. There's a photograph of her on my desk. I remember taking it. I know it's my mother. If I turn it face down for a few minutes, though, I find myself struggling to remember what she looked like before I picked it up.